Hi my lovely creatives! In today's video we are making this easy watercolor forest painting using the wet on wet technique. This landscape watercolor painting is perfect for beginners. We will go through the painting process step by step together, so grab yourself some materials and let's get started. I like to tape my paper to my table, and I use normal painter's tape for this, but you can use washi tape as well. I am starting by making my paper wet with a large brush, and I like to use the largest brush that I have. Well, I might have a larger one if I have a look around, but I use a large brush to make my paper wet because it's a bit quicker and it spreads the water nice and evenly. I'm going to use quite monochrome colors today, so a bluish, green and maybe some black, but I will leave all my reds and browns and oranges aside for today. I also decided to use my travel set of Cotman watercolors. I have had this set for absolutely ages and I really love using it, and I've not used it for a while, so I decided to use it today. I'm using the palette of the other watercolor box there to mix my colors in, but I'm painting only with my Cotman set. I just quite like this palette, so I decided to use it today, but keeping my materials quite simple. When you paint watercolors wet on wet, the paint tends to move around over the paper and spread out and create a really soft layer of paint. So I'm going over this paper multiple times and just create this ombre look, this darker area at the bottom and lighter at the top by adding multiple layers of this green and blue paint. That was just a quick overview of what that would look like. So you can see I'm really taking my time. Just slowly add layer by layer of paint on the paper, and because the paper is wet the colors mix up really naturally, so I'm starting with green and then add a layer of blue and just taking my time and slowly increasing the value and the intensity of the color for this first layer. You will have to let your paper dry in between a few times before you continue painting, which is a good way of practicing patience, or you can grab a hairdryer and dry your paper a little bit faster. So you can see that I am now starting to add a little bit of blue to the base color. I found just the green a little bit too vibrant and I want to have a bit more of an like a turquoise teal sort of color. So I'm mixing in a bit of blue and I'm mixing it on the paper. So I'm trying to keep the top really light and then the bottom of the paper a bit darker. So I'm mixing up a little bit darker paint on my palette, a little bit more blue and a bit more green. And I let my paper dry a little bit in between these layers, and now I'm adding a second layer of color, still quite wet, over the colors I already had. You can see once in a while I dip my brush into the paint and make sure my paint is wet enough. And I'm really looking for a vibrant gradient that goes from fairly dark to really light, about halfway onto the paper. You can see just by left and right strokes I can spread that paint that I added to the bottom out towards the top. It's quite fun to paint with these paints. I've not really used them for a little while, and it's quite funny to go into these little pots with this large brush, but it works really well. So there we go, just spreading out the paints towards the top. I love creating gradients. This layer is now dry to the touch and I'm going over it with yet another layer of this bluish green color that I've mixed on my palette. I have not let my paper dry completely, it's still a little bit damp, which is fine for this ombre, for this layer. As soon as you want to start adding more details, you need to make sure your paper is dried properly, but for this stage a little bit of damp is still fine. So I'm mixing up some darker colors, some darker blues and some darker greens. And I feel like this misty look, a little bit of mystery is already happening. Even though I'm not painting any of the trees or any of the actual objects yet, I find that the atmosphere sort of starts to come forward. I let that layer dry again, there's always lots of drying time, and now I'm going over with, I think this might be my final layer, but let's see what it looks like once it's dry. So mixing up some darker paint again, going over my painting. The colors are quite vibrant now. And at the top I will use a bit of tissue paper to create a bit of misty cloudiness. So let me show you that again, slowly going over the bottom part of the paper, making it darker. And then with a bit of tissue paper, tapping the top, and this creates a bit of that misty effect that I'm looking for. It's quite subtle, but that's okay at this stage. Mist is subtle. So I'm letting this dry again. And I'm adding in a little bit of yellow, this yellow ochre color with my greens and blues. Just changing the tone a little bit. My paint is quite thick at this stage, as far as watercolor is thick. So and I'm making that bottom layer even darker. You can see with adding some of the yellow in the color, the tone of the paint changes a little bit, which I like. And because the watercolor paint is a little bit translucent, all the colors that I've added before shine through. You can see the paint strokes of my brush through a little bit, but as soon as you go over it with a little bit of a wet brush, the strokes disappear. Again, just dapping the top, creating that misty effect, that texture of seeing the layers underneath shine through. And more drying time. We are now slowly going to add a little bit more detail to our watercolor painting. So I'm mixing up some colors, still staying within the same tone, so some blues and greens together, maybe with a little bit of that yellow ochre. And I'm adding some trees to the paper. And I don't think I've ever said let your paper dry so many times in one video. But before you add the trees, really make sure that your paper is dry, otherwise they will just blur out and mix up with the colors underneath. And although I do want them to be a bit loose, you want to decide where you want to make them wet and where they blur out and where the lines stay more precise. So I'm going over these lines with water, just by with a clean brush, adding some water, just to blur out these trees a little bit. These are going to be the softest background trees, the ones that are a little bit faded into the distance. So I'm going over my painting with a bit of tissue paper, soften the edges, blurring it out. And the trees in the middle are the ones furthest away, and on the outside the trees are going to be a bit closer. So they are longer all the way from the front to the top of the paper. We're letting this dry before we add another layer. I pause my video every time I let my picture dry, because that part is really boring for you to watch, but make sure you let things dry. So just adding another layer, blurring it out, and letting it dry again. It is time to put my large flat brush aside and switch to a slightly smaller brush. This is still a fairly large brush, it's a size 14 round brush, but it means I can create some smaller marks and some finer lines on the paper. So I'm adding even another layer of trees. I will show you a little bit slower now. Just another layer of trees with the darkest ones, the biggest ones at the sides and the smaller ones in the middle. And it's okay if they are a little bit wonky, if they blur out a little bit. My paint is significantly darker than it was before. I've added a little bit of black to my greenish blue. And I'm going over it with a bit of water to blur them out a little bit. I love adding layers like this. It doesn't have to be super precise, you can just trust that the paint has a bit of a mind of its own. So sometimes just beautiful, amazing things happen without them being planned for. And I also know that all of this will dry up a little bit lighter than what it looks like right now. So maybe some longer trees. I really want it to feel like there's a whole forest behind these trees, not just a row of, a lane, but I want there to be a whole forest with lots of different shapes and maybe creatures behind what we can see. What I'm doing here is with a little bit of wet paint add a bit of hint of leaves to the top. So my paint is very wet, very diluted with lots of water, and I'm just adding some shadows and some rounded shapes to the top and maybe blur them out a bit with some tissue paper. So again, I've let everything dry, made myself a cup of coffee, and I'm continuing this process. The wonderful thing about using monochromatic paint, so only using paint in one color, is that you don't have to think about the color that you're creating. All I need to do is to make each layer a little bit darker, so add a little bit less water to it or slightly darker pigments, and you naturally create that depth in your picture. So I am starting to add some of the darker trees. And they don't have to be straight. Actually, they would look even more natural if they're a bit wonky or a bit on a slope. So when you add your trees, make sure that there's a bit of a natural shape in them. And what I'm doing is also adding some of darker trees a little bit further back. So I'm just letting it dry for a moment. Clean my brush, and this brush has a really nice sharp tip so I can create finer lines with it. Adding some leaves or stones or shadows onto the ground, just a bit of texture to make the picture more interesting. At the moment it feels a bit like water to me, as if there's reflections in the water. In my imagination this was going to be a path, but it feels a little bit like water to me at the moment. With this dark paint, this kind of fairly thick paint for watercolor, I'm adding some side branches as well. You can really use your imagination here. You don't have to add the branches in the same places as I do, but just see what feels good, and maybe there's some more shapes a little bit further back that you want to add. This is where your picture changes from an abstract picture into a forest. So I want the base of that tree a little bit darker. And I'm really taking my time for this. There's absolutely no rush. Make sure that I let things dry a bit in between. Taking a moment to look at it. Swapping to a smaller brush. And just slowly and steadily adding smaller twigs and branches to each of these trees. And I make sure that they are a little bit on an angle as well. Not everything goes straight up, but there's also some shapes that are leaning over a bit, some trees that are not completely straight. Let me show you this again in a time lapse. I love a time lapse. I find it so much fun to see a picture come together like this. So you can see some of the trees are a bit darker than others. And I'm really working on creating depth at the moment. With some watery paint, I am now adding some shadows to the bases of the trees. And again, maybe I'll add a little bit more shadows between the trees. I'm just having some playtime here I go over the entire picture with a bit of water just to blur things out and to bring pictures together. And I'm just having fun with it. So try not to take it too serious. It's okay if the paint blurs out a little bit or if some unexpected things happen. I'm also adding some leaves to the trees, so you can see with some horizontal moves and some darker colors I add some leaf shapes to the top of the page. I try and keep the middle part of the top part of the page, so the sort of part that's the sky, I try to keep that free. You can see I use a bit of tissue paper to soak up the extra paint if it's a bit too much. Because the paper is fairly dry now, by the time I come back to the top part of the paper, it's dry enough to paint over. So I'm adding a little bit of extra shadows to the bottom. And then by the time I have done that, the top bit is dry enough to paint over again. So mixing up some darker paint again. And you've already seen this in the little time-lapse sneak preview that I showed you a moment ago. I am making the leaves at the top a bit darker as well. You can see I love the texture that this flat brush creates. Different brushes can create different shapes and different textures in watercolor painting. And I use the flatness of the brush to create different shapes for these leaves. So some shadows at the bottom of the trees as well. I let everything dry again, and with a smaller brush I'm going to add in a bit more detail. I like to use a different variety of brushes, and I don't think your watercolor brushes have to be super expensive, but it's nice to have a few different sizes to your availability. So for the detail I like to use a smaller brush. I think this is a size 5 or 6. And I'm adding a bit of darker detail to some of these trees in the foreground. Maybe add some extra branches as well. And this is a general rule of creating landscapes, is that the objects that are closest to us have the highest value. And that means the most intense color, basically. So in this case, in these blue and dark tones, I add a bit more black to these trees in the foreground. And I also decided that there's a tree here that's going to be a bit more wonky than the others. So I'm changing the shapes a little bit, just to make it a bit more interesting than these really straight trees. This one is going to be a little bit more on an angle. And I'm not looking at any references at the moment, I'm just painting this from my imagination. Here I decided to add in a few mushrooms in the foreground. I think these type of forests always look a little bit magical or a bit mystical. Even in reality, I love a forest. I think it's my favorite type of nature to be in, and they often look a little bit magical. What is your favorite type of nature to be in? Would you like to be at the seaside or mountains, forest? I love mountains too. Maybe I'll paint a mountain range for our next painting. Yeah, let me know underneath if there's a type of landscape that you would really like to paint. Let me know, and maybe I will film a tutorial for it next time. So I'm adding a little bit more detail, slowly and steadily. Again, just taking my time. There's absolutely no rush. And I love creating small shapes, and every time I take a little break, look at my picture and see if I'm missing something still. Let me play you another little time lapse, just because it's so much fun to do. You You can see with a small brush I'm adding some grasses and some extra leaves, some birds in the sky, some shadows on the ground, and we will look at this a little bit more in detail in a moment. When I'm making a painting such as this, I often imagine a bit of a story going on. And I think maybe that's because I make a lot of illustrations for books and for children's books, but I love to imagine the background of this forest. Is there a castle at the end? Is it a magical forest? Maybe it is a forest in an old town where someone is going for a walk, or sometimes the story can be a little bit scary or really happy, or I don't know, I just love to create a little bit of a backstory behind these pictures. With this small brush I'm adding in just a little bit more texture here and there. Some lines, wipe them out with a little bit of water. And this is all very subtle. Every time I just take a moment and see if I need a little bit more. I really want to create that sense of depth in the background. So back to my large brush, just adding some shadows on the ground. I think there is quite a low sun, either sunrise or sunset, but the light is very low, so there's long shadows on the ground. And I want to create a sense of the light shining from the trees from the left hand side. So all the trees on the left cast some shadows onto the ground, and then there's also some shadows on the right, but towards the other side. So I'm adding some washes to the painting, and if you're careful and your layers underneath are dry, you can quite easily add a wash of wet paint over an area where you've added a lot of detail. So you can see I do that really carefully, just to create a slightly different tone or make some areas a little bit darker. And when you do this, you need to make sure that you use a very gentle touch and not rub too much onto the areas that you've painted already, because they might blur out. So making that path a little bit darker in the distance and letting it dry. I don't think I've said let it dry so often in a video, but it's very important. So make sure that every time you start a new layer, you take your time to let your picture dry. You've already seen this in the time lapse. I'm using a really small brush. My paper is dry, so I can add some details again, to add some birds in the sky. They also give a bit of a sense of perspective. If you add animals or like objects or things like mushrooms to a watercolor painting, it gives a sense of how large other objects are in perspective. And you can play with this, of course, like add a really large bird or a really large mushroom, or make it extra small to give a different vibe to your picture. But generally, if you have a landscape and you add some buildings, people or animals to it, it gives a sense of how large everything else is or how far away things are. So I'm just adding some finer lines again. This painting probably took me an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to complete in total, and I have condensed this, cutting out the waiting time and some of the more boring parts to about half an hour video. But it didn't take me a massive amount of time. It's not like a painting I worked on for 3 days. So I'm making the shadows a little bit clearer. Almost finished with my painting. This is really the finishing touches. I was sort of thinking of adding a castle here in the background. and I sort of decided against it, so I'm blurring it out again, making it a bit more of a shadow between the trees. It didn't feel quite fitting, so I'm taking it out again. Sometimes you can play with your watercolors a little bit, not everything is set in stone. And the last thing that I'm doing is with white gouache, adding some highlights to some of the trees. So as I said before, I want the light to come through the trees on the left hand side, and that means that the light casts a little bit of light onto the left hand side of some of the trees or some details, and I don't want it to look like snow, so I'm keeping it very subtle. And it's easy to overdo this, but I love using white gouache for some highlights. So I'm keeping it very pure, with only a little bit of water added to it to make it run on the paper, but keeping it fairly thick. And white gouache is very opaque, and it's a beautiful medium to add highlights. I think when you do this, it can be a little bit addictive, and less is more. So stop on time, you don't want to add white lines around everything in your picture, but a little here and there can be a beautiful addition. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe. I share weekly painting and drawing videos, lots of tutorials on my channel, and at times I also share some of my journey as a freelance illustrator, how I make a living, and some of my personal art as well. I have a shop, so this painting will be for sale in my shop. A link of it will be in the description of this video, so if you're interested, be quick, I don't think I'll be up for long. Thank you so much for being here with me today. And let me know if there's something you want to paint with me in the future, because who knows, I might listen and film it. Let's take up the tape. There we go, I need to be careful. Let's take off the tape. And then we're done for today. So I've already said it, but I'll say it again. Make sure you subscribe. Click on that little bell at the end underneath the video, because then you'll get notified every time I post something. And thank you so much for being here with me. My name is Irene, and I will see you around soon.